The train slowed as it crossed the flat fields of central Kansas, and the German prisoners pressed their faces against the narrow windows, trying to understand where they had been brought after weeks of travel across an ocean and then thousands of miles of unfamiliar American land. Because the world outside looked nothing like the bombed cities or muddy battlefields they had left behind in Europe. And when the guards finally told them they would be working on a farm, many of the prisoners exchanged uncertain glances, convinced that the word farm must hide some kind of punishment they had not yet imagined. Yet what waited beyond the camp fence would challenge everything they thought they knew about captivity in wartime America. The truck carrying the German prisoners rolled slowly across the flat Kansas countryside, raising a thin cloud of dust that drifted behind the vehicle as it followed a narrow dirt road cutting through endless fields of wheat and corn. And the men sitting in the back watched the land carefully through the wooden rails of the truck bed because the scenery around them felt strangely peaceful compared to the battlefields where many of them had been captured months earlier, yet none of them allowed themselves to relax completely since they had no clear idea what kind of work awaited them beyond the next group of barns appearing on the horizon. When the guards at the camp had first announced that several prisoners would be sent to work on nearby farms, the reaction inside the barracks had been filled with suspicion rather than relief, because many of the German soldiers had grown up hearing stories that enemy nations would force captured troops into brutal labor, and the word farm sounded too simple to be trusted after everything they had experienced during the war, especially for men who had spent months behind barbed wire, wondering what their future might look like once the fighting ended. As the truck moved deeper into the Kansas countryside, the landscape opened into wide agricultural land that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the bright summer sky. And several of the prisoners quietly exchanged glances because the fields looked nothing like the destroyed villages or defensive trenches that had dominated their lives in Europe, where war had transformed farmland into muddy battlegrounds filled with craters and broken machinery, while here the wheat stood tall and unbroken, moving gently in the warm wind that swept across the plains. Eventually, the truck slowed beside a wooden farmhouse surrounded by barns, fences, and long rows of crops that shimmered under the sunlight, and the prisoners climbed down carefully while the American guards watched them with calm but attentive expressions, because although the situation appeared relaxed compared to military camps in Europe, the rules were still clear and the prisoners understood that they remained under supervision at all times while working outside the camp. A middle-aged farmer approached them across the yard with the steady walk of someone who had spent his entire life working the land. And through the interpreter who accompanied the guards, he began explaining that the harvest season had arrived earlier than expected that year, which meant that many farms across Kansas needed extra hands to bring the crops in before storms could damage the fields. Since a large number of local workers were serving in the American Army overseas, and the remaining farmers simply could not manage the workload alone. The explanation created a quiet moment among the prisoners because the situation sounded strangely practical rather than hostile, and several of the men looked toward the surrounding fields where mechanical harvesters stood waiting beside rows of golden wheat, realizing that the work they were about to begin might resemble the kind of labor many of them had performed before the war had taken them away from their homes. A thought that felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The farmer then pointed toward the open fields and described the tasks that needed to be done during the day, including repairing sections of fence damaged by wind, gathering cut wheat into organized rows, and helping move equipment between barns scattered across the property. And although the guards remained nearby to ensure everything followed the rules established for prisoner labor, the tone of the conversation remained calm and businesslike, creating an atmosphere that felt far removed from the tension the prisoners had expected when they first heard they would be sent outside the camp. As the men followed the farmer toward the edge of the wheat field where their work would begin, several of them paused briefly to look across the wide Kansas plain stretching toward the distant horizon, And for a moment, the quiet wind moving through the crops reminded them of a life that had existed before uniforms, battles, and captivity. Yet none of them could fully understand how they had traveled from the front lines of a global war to this peaceful American farm where the only immediate task was to help bring in a harvest. The work began slowly that first morning because the farmer understood that most of the prisoners had never seen the wide mechanical equipment used on American farms. And although many of the German soldiers had grown up around agriculture in Europe, the scale of farming in Kansas surprised them as they stood near the edge of the wheat field watching the machines that would soon move through the tall grain. Since the land around them seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the bright sky, giving the impression that the farm alone covered more ground than entire villages back home. Through the interpreter, the farmer explained the tasks that needed attention before the harvesters could move safely through the fields, describing how recent winds had loosened several wooden fence posts along the property line and how sections of the outer field still needed to be cleared of loose tools and broken boards left behind after earlier repairs. And as the instructions were translated, the prisoners listened carefully, realizing that the work being asked of them was ordinary farm labor rather than the harsh punishment they had feared when they first heard they would be sent outside the camp. Several of the older prisoners quickly recognized the rhythm of the tasks because they had grown up working on farms before the war had taken them into military service, and they began organizing the small work teams with quiet efficiency as they carried wooden posts, hammers, and coils of wire toward the damaged fence line that ran along the far edge of the property. While the guards positioned themselves nearby in a relaxed but watchful manner that reminded everyone that even in this peaceful setting, the rules of captivity still applied. As the morning passed, the German soldiers worked steadily beneath the Kansas sun, repairing fence posts and tightening wire while the wind moved gently through the wheat fields beside them. And although conversation remained limited because of the language barrier, the shared routine of manual labor created a strange familiarity between the prisoners and the farm environment around them. Since the sounds of tools striking wood and the creaking of windmills rising above the barns felt closer to ordinary rural life than anything they had experienced since the war began. What surprised many of the prisoners most was the absence of the constant shouting or rigid discipline they had expected from their guards, because the American soldiers supervising the work detail mostly observed from a short distance, while occasionally speaking with the farmer or checking that the prisoners remained within the designated work area. And although rifles rested across their shoulders, the overall atmosphere remained calm, creating a situation that several of the Germans quietly admitted felt very different from the stories they had heard about enemy prison camps. Around midday, the farmer's truck approached the field carrying large metal containers filled with drinking water along with simple food prepared by the household near the farmhouse. And when the guards allowed the workers to pause for a break, the prisoners gathered in the shade beside one of the barns where wooden crates had been arranged as temporary seats, creating a moment of rest that felt strangely normal compared to the harsh conditions many of them had endured during the final months of fighting before their capture. The meal itself was modest but filling, consisting of bread, potatoes, and preserved meat that followed the regulations established for prisoner labor crews. Yet the quiet setting of the farm and the open fields stretching around them created a peaceful atmosphere that none of the prisoners had expected when they first stepped onto the truck leaving the camp that morning. And as they sat listening to the wind moving across the Kansas plains, several of them exchanged thoughtful glances, realizing that the farm work they had feared might actually become the most ordinary part of their lives since the war had begun. As the days passed and the work crews returned regularly to the same Kansas farm, the unfamiliar environment gradually began to transform into a routine that the prisoners could almost predict, because each morning the truck arrived at the camp gate shortly after sunrise. The guards called the same list of names, and the same group of German soldiers climbed into the back of the vehicle to travel once again across the quiet rural roads leading toward the wide agricultural land that had begun to feels strangely distant from the realities of the war still raging across Europe. The journey itself became a moment of quiet observation for the prisoners because the Kansas countryside revealed small details that many of them had never imagined seeing during wartime captivity, including wooden farmhouses standing alone among miles of open fields, windmills slowly turning above water wells, and long trains carrying grain across the plains toward distant cities. And although the men rarely spoke during these rides, they carefully watched the landscape as if trying to understand how such calm places could exist while entire nations were locked in violent conflict across the ocean. By the time the truck reached the farm each morning, the work teams already understood their tasks without needing long explanations, since the previous days had taught them how the farmer organized his harvest operations, and they moved toward the barns and equipment sheds with a quiet efficiency that even the guards seemed to appreciate, because the prisoners no longer hesitated or questioned the instructions that were translated through the interpreter, but instead began their work with the steady rhythm that agricultural labor required during the critical weeks of harvest season. For several of the German soldiers, the work awakened memories that had been buried beneath years of military discipline. Because before uniforms and battlefields, many of them had lived in villages where farming shaped the rhythm of everyday life. And the simple actions of lifting wooden crates, guiding wagons through narrow field paths, and stacking harvested wheat beside storage barns felt familiar in a way that war never had, creating a strange emotional contrast between their identity as prisoners of war and the ordinary rural tasks they now performed under the wide Kansas sky. The farmer himself noticed this growing confidence among the work crews and occasionally observed their progress from the edge of the fields, speaking with the guards through the interpreter about which sections of the property still required attention before the largest harvest machines could move safely through the grain. And although communication between the farmer and the prisoners remained limited by language, the mutual understanding created by shared work slowly replaced the uncertainty that had filled their first day on the farm. What continued to surprise the prisoners most was the level of trust required for the daily routine to function, because although the guards remained present and the rules were clearly enforced, the open farmland offered countless directions where a desperate man might attempt escape. Yet none of the prisoners tried to run during those early weeks, since the unfamiliar countryside, the distance from cities, and the constant presence of local communities made the idea seem both risky and pointless, especially when the work itself had begun to create a predictable structure inside the otherwise uncertain life of captivity. Late in the afternoon, when the sun began lowering toward the distant horizon, the prisoners often paused briefly to look across the fields they had worked throughout the day, and the sight of long rows of harvested wheat stretching toward the barns gave them a quiet sense of accomplishment that few had expected to feel as prisoners in a foreign country, because despite the uniforms they wore and the guards watching nearby, the simple progress of the harvest reminded them that even in the middle of a global war, ordinary labor continued shaping the lives of people far away from the front lines. By the middle of the harvest season, the routine of traveling between the camp and the Kansas farm had settled into a rhythm that almost felt predictable to the prisoners, because the same truck arrived each morning beneath the pale light of sunrise, the same guards supervised the work detail, and the same wide fields waited beyond the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. Yet despite the familiarity of the routine, the German soldiers still noticed new details about the farm each day as the progress of the harvest slowly transformed the landscape around them. Large sections of wheat that had once stood tall and golden were now replaced by orderly rows of cut grain waiting to be gathered and stored, and the heavy harvesting machines moved steadily across the fields while the prisoners helped guide wagons and carry equipment between barns scattered across the property, creating a steady pattern of activity that filled the long Kansas afternoons with the sounds of engines, wooden wheels, and wind moving across the open plains. For many of the prisoners, the physical effort of the work brought an unexpected sense of purpose to their days because the tasks required concentration and coordination, especially when moving large bundles of harvested wheat or repairing sections of fencing damaged by windstorms that occasionally swept across the region. And although the guards remained present, the atmosphere around the work crews had grown noticeably calmer compared to their first uncertain morning on the farm. During one particularly warm afternoon, the farmer approached the work crew with the interpreter to explain that a large storage barn on the far side of the property needed to be cleared and prepared for the next stage of the harvest, since the grain already gathered from earlier fields would soon be transported there for storage before being shipped across the country. And as the instructions were translated, the prisoners followed him across a dirt path leading toward a tall wooden structure that stood slightly apart from the rest of the farm buildings. The barn doors were pulled open slowly, revealing a wide interior space filled with stacks of grain sacks and wooden tools arranged neatly along the walls. And the prisoners stepped inside to begin organizing the storage area, while sunlight filtered through narrow gaps in the wooden boards above them, creating thin beams of light that moved slowly across the dusty floor as the afternoon progressed. What caught the attention of several prisoners was not the work itself, but the simple fact that the barn stood completely open to the surrounding fields, because beyond the wide doorway the Kansas plains stretched uninterrupted toward the distant horizon. And for a brief moment the men realized how different this situation felt compared to the enclosed prison compounds they had imagined when thinking about captivity in enemy territory. The guards remained near the entrance of the barn, quietly observing the activity while speaking occasionally with the farmer about the progress of the harvest. And although the rules were never forgotten, the scene inside the building resembled an ordinary agricultural workday more than a guarded prison detail, which created a strange contrast that many of the prisoners struggled to fully understand. As the afternoon sun lowered across the plains, the work inside the barn continued steadily, with sacks being lifted, tools reorganized, and storage areas prepared for the coming deliveries of grain. And while the men moved through the wide interior space, several of them paused briefly to glance outside toward the endless Kansas fields where the wind continued moving through the remaining wheat. A quiet reminder that even during a global war, the rhythms of farming still shaped the lives of people far away from the battlefronts. By the time the final weeks of the harvest arrived, the German prisoners who had been assigned to the Kansas farm no longer stepped down from the transport truck with the same uncertainty they had felt on their first morning outside the camp, because the long days of work across the fields had slowly replaced suspicion with a quiet familiarity that grew stronger with each visit. And although the uniforms they wore still marked them as prisoners of war, the routines of agricultural labor had created a rhythm that felt surprisingly close to the normal life many of them had once known before the war had carried them far from their homes. The fields surrounding the farmhouse now looked very different from the wide stretches of standing wheat the prisoners had seen during their first trip across the property, since most of the grain had been cut and gathered into storage barns, while the remaining work focused on moving the final loads of harvest into tall wooden structures that stood near the railroad line crossing the distant edge of the farmland. And each day the prisoners helped load wagons, guide equipment, and organize the stacks of grain that would soon begin their journey toward mills and cities across the country. For the farmer, the successful harvest represented the difference between survival and hardship during wartime, because with so many American workers serving overseas, the entire season had depended on a small number of farmhands and the labor provided by prisoners of war sent from nearby camps. And although the arrangement followed official wartime agreements, the farmer often watched the work crews with a thoughtful expression that suggested he understood how unusual the situation must appear to men who had expected captivity to look very different. Late one afternoon, as the final wagons were being unloaded beside the storage barn, the farmer approached the group through the interpreter and explained that the largest part of the harvest had now been completed earlier than expected, thanks in part to the steady effort of the work crews who had helped repair fences, gather grain, and prepare the barns during the busiest weeks of the season. And although his words remained simple, the meaning was clear enough for the prisoners to understand that their work had played a real role in bringing the harvest safely in before the arrival of autumn storms. The moment created a quiet pause among the prisoners because many of them had not expected to feel any connection to the success of an American farm while living as captives during wartime. Yet the long weeks spent working across the Kansas plains had gradually created a sense of responsibility toward the tasks placed before them, since the routine of labor offered a rare feeling of usefulness in a life otherwise defined by waiting behind the fences of a prisoner camp. As the sun began to sink toward the far horizon, casting long shadows across the harvested fields, the prisoners helped finish the final tasks of the day while the wind moved gently across the open land that surrounded the farm in every direction, and several of the men paused briefly to look across the quiet Kansas countryside, where rows of cut wheat now stretched toward distant barns and windmills, realizing that the place they had once feared as a hidden punishment had instead revealed something they had never expected to discover during captivity. What they had seen on that farm had not been cruelty or secret hardship, but a peaceful corner of wartime America where ordinary people struggled to keep their farms running while the world fought a distant conflict. And for the German prisoners who had worked those fields under the wide Kansas sky, the experience remained one of the most surprising chapters of their lives as prisoners far from home. When the truck finally carried the prisoners back toward the camp at the end of the harvest season, the Kansas fields slowly disappeared behind them as the road stretched across the quiet plains, and many of the German soldiers remained silent during the journey because the weeks they had spent working on the farm had changed the way they imagined captivity in America, replacing the fear they once carried with a more complicated understanding of the country where they now waited for the war to end. The work had not erased the reality that they were prisoners living far from home. Yet the experience of helping bring in a harvest on a peaceful Kansas farm revealed a side of wartime America they had never expected to see, where ordinary farmers struggled to keep their land productive, while thousands of miles away soldiers from many nations continued fighting across distant battlefields. For the prisoners who had stood in those fields beneath the wide Kansas sky, the memory of that farm remained a quiet reminder that even during the darkest years of war, moments of ordinary life could still appear in the most unexpected places. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.